This is Letters in Politics. I am Mitch Jeserich, and we now go for a different perspective on YouTube and cable providers blocking RT America. My guest is Jessica González. Jessica González is the co-CEO of the media activist group Free Press. She is also the co-founder of the campaign Change the Terms. It has been advocating for RT's removal from YouTube. She joins me over Zoom. Jessica González, I thank you for taking this time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Tell me about your response to YouTube removing RT from its services, and also about the campaign Change the Terms.
Thanks, Mitch. Well, in a word, we're pleased that YouTube has removed RT and Sputnik and other Russian state-sponsored media that is pushing pro-war propaganda, that is working to legitimize the violence that Russia is perpetrating against Ukraine. So we are pleased with that outcome. We hope that other social media outlets will follow suit. Change the Terms is a coalition. We have about 60 some odd organizations, racial justice groups, civil rights, digital rights organizations that are focused on disrupting the flow of hate and disinformation online. We've been taking a very careful approach to balance free expression and the need to keep people safe and healthy in these really complicated times. So I work with a steering committee that includes the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, Southern Poverty Law Center, Muslim Advocates, Color of Change, National Hispanic Media Coalition, a number of other organizations that are working to really identify systems changes that the platforms can make to stop amplifying bigotry and lies.
YouTube in its statement said and cited its policy barring content that, quote, denies, minimizes, or trivializes documented violent events. And it said that Russia's invasion of Ukraine fell under its violent events policy. I think I heard you say the word trivialize and minimize. What does that mean? How has RT done that? RT America specifically done that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is certainly trying to sell the American people in Latin America and others, a false narrative about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now. And so by selling that false narrative, it is in essence trying to legitimize war crimes against the Ukrainian people. And this is really dangerous in a time like this. This is, there is obviously extreme violence happening. Russia is committing war crimes and other mass atrocities against the Ukrainian people. And they're also, perpetrating information warfare where they're trying to not just spread disinformation through their own channels, but also using other social media channels as a way to amplify that narrative. So they're attempting to legitimize a mass atrocity through the media. And this isn't much unlike what we saw during World War II, where the radio airwaves were being used to legitimize atrocities against the Jewish people. This is, much like what we've seen in other atrocities around the world, where state-sponsored media is used to legitimize violence and murder.
I mean, there's certainly war going on, but we haven't heard of anything that would resemble what did happen to Nazis in World War. To Jews from Nazis in World War II. Yeah,
and please forgive me if that was insensitive, but I want to draw the parallel between the legitimization of violence and murder through the airwaves. So, of course, yes, I'm not suggesting that would amount to the Holocaust, but I think there's serious mass atrocities happening committed against civilians in the Ukraine, and that RT and Sputnik and other state-sponsored media are trying to legitimize those acts.
I went to try to watch some of RT's most recent shows concerning the war to see what it was saying. You may not be surprised, I couldn't find it. It was all blocked on YouTube. That said, we did have previously Lee Camp on. Lee Camp hosts a program called Redacted Tonight on RT America. We've also had others who host programs on RT America, like Chris Hedges on. And what they told me, and I think this was in line with a New York Times article that was written over the weekend, titled something to the extent of what it's like to work within RT America. What Lee Camp told me, and I think this was largely echoed to what you find in that article and by others, is that they're not told what to say by Russia, that they have full independence of what they are going to say. And then Lee Camp told me that he criticized Russia's invasion into Ukraine. He thought that was overstepped, that was wrong. I don't want to use, those aren't his words, those are mine, but that's basically what he said. But he also thought it was important to provide context concerning the situation there, including NATO expansion. Yes, he brought up Nazis in Ukraine. Maybe it's an overstatement, but certainly there documented that is
sure,
there.
Everywhere. They're
Mm-hmm.
everywhere,
Yeah.
including in Russia. Yeah.
Yeah. So why RT America? I mean, what's wrong with that narrative of and it may be wrong, but we have a right to be wrong, don't we? What's wrong with the narrative that was being found on RT America?
Sure. We have a right to be wrong. And I want to make something really clear, Mitch. We are not asking for RT America to be taken down off the internet. They have every right to have a website. They have every right to share content. We are asking that they not be amplified by social media platforms. I think there's an important distinction there. We're also not asking for the internet to be shut down in Russia. We think it's really important that information is still allowed to flow. But it's one thing to say we don't want to have the government saying what goes up and what stays down, and an entirely different thing to say we expect social media platforms to be very responsible for what they are amplifying, not just what they're hosting, but they all have these algorithms, right, that will amplify information. And while there may be some responsible journalists at RT, and in fact, I'm sure there is also a massive amount of disinformation coming from that site at a really delicate time. So I think at least as a temporary measure, this is an important step by YouTube. Now, RT is still free to have a website and attract people to that site, certainly. And we would not try to stand in the way. That's where we're big proponents of net neutrality. Any one of us with even a small amount of means can start a website and share information, whether that information is accurate or not. But what we don't have a right to is to be amplified over YouTube and other social media platforms, and especially if a large amount of our content is spreading either bigotry or lies.
What is the misinformation that they're putting out?
There is quite a bit of misinformation there trying to legitimize war crimes against the Ukrainian people.
Such as
just like telling a different story, overemphasizing the narrative around the Nazis. The truth is, yeah, this world has a problem with Nazis and white supremacists. There are white supremacists in Russia, in Ukraine, in Germany, in the United States. We all have this problem. But the narrative that Russia is going in to save the Ukrainian people from a massive Nazi occupation is just not true. And the way that is being utilized to legitimize the acts of aggression against Ukraine is deeply problematic.
I think there's a strong argument that could be made that they overstate the Nazi role in Ukraine. I think there's an argument to say that they certainly haven't taken control of the government, of the state apparatus, that they performed extremely poorly in the last election. Volodymyr Zelensky himself is Jewish, has family ancestors who've died in the Holocaust. But this is still something that is debated, and we do have a right to be wrong, don't we?
Sure. We have a right to be wrong, and RT has a right to do that on its own website. It doesn't have a right to be amplified by YouTube.
RT is not the only outlet that says these things. You will also find it on the Jimmy Dore show. You'll find it on the Gray Zone. You'll find it, and we've had people on this program with differing perspectives, and we've had one person who has also made that same argument. Should these other outlets also be deplatformed on YouTube?
I think you have to look at patterns here. I think what you're doing here, Mitch, is you're providing context. You're providing differing perspectives, and you're letting your listeners think for themselves and figure out what makes sense to them based on the facts that you're laying out. I see what you're doing here is you have a commitment to hearing both sides, but also getting the facts right.
I appreciate that.
A lot of these outlets aren't trying to do that. It is contextless information. It is propaganda, and it's put out there with a purpose, right? Like we see RT in English. We see RT in Spanish. It's not geared towards informing the Russian people. It's geared towards putting out a Russian worldview to the rest of the world. And frankly, they have a right to do that. I would never take them down off the internet. But I don't think at a time when Russia is clearly, out of bounds in how they're acting, that doesn't mean that site and the state propaganda that they're carrying forward gets to be amplified over YouTube.
Thank you for those words, what we're trying to do. But the other programs I mentioned, say, for example, the Jimmy Dore Show. This is a very wildly popular program on YouTube, has 1 million subscribers. Most of his videos get 100,000 hits or more. He's not necessarily probing different sides. He's bringing a perspective. Should his show and shows like his, maybe like the Gray Zone, should those shows be deplatformed from YouTube?
Well, I can't really speak to that because I haven't studied or looked into those shows. So I don't want to say, I want to be careful. What I can say is the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, who are partners, did a deep dive on what was happening on RT and Sputnik, as did our partners for Center for Countering Digital Hate. And what they found, what they presented to the coalition was, a lot of evidence about the role that those two entities were playing in spreading state-sponsored or, certainly state-aligned propaganda. And as a coalition, we felt very convinced that in those two instances, they were violating YouTube's terms of service and that YouTube had a responsibility to take them down. So that was our narrow ask. We actually didn't go beyond that in the letter that we sent to YouTube last week.
Respecting that you haven't done a deep dive on these other programs, is it significant to you that RT America itself is state-backed, is supported by the Russian government? Is that a part of the calculation?
I mean, it's not insignificant. I think there's a difference between, but I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to, are these entities violating the terms of service of YouTube? Are they pushing hate and disinformation? If those entities were providing, for the most part, very balanced news and information, I'd have a different viewpoint, even if it was state-backed. But yeah, I think, we have to be careful about how government-sponsored media rolls out, especially in these very sort of sensitive and vulnerable moments.
Nick Clegg, who's with Facebook, or I guess Meta, used to be Prime Minister of Great Britain, he put out a statement concerning the deplatforming of RT America on YouTube. He said this, quote, in his tweet, "We have received requests from a number of governments and the EU, the European Union, to take further steps in relation to Russian state-controlled media." The fact that that YouTube was clearly being pressured from governments, should that be at all a concern?
Yeah, we're really concerned about that. And in fact, in Change the Terms as Model policies, we recommend that they're providing utmost transparency when governments are asking them to take down content. And this is why I think this is different. Like what we're doing here is we are community organizations, civil and digital rights groups, Global Project is working with partners around the world. And we're hearing from NGOs the need to disrupt the flow of Russian propaganda, right? NGOs are standing up and voicing our free expression and saying we have a concern about this. I think this is much different than a government that has positional power, military power, all these other, law enforcement powers. That we got to be much more careful when governments are asking for content to be taken down.
And that's what they're doing in this case.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. In fact, we've had some partners make calls for the government to take down content, and we've declined to participate in those. But we are all about community organizations and people who have suffered. Change the terms is led by women and people of color, people who know firsthand what it's like to face hate, harassment, and disinformation campaigns run against us online. And we think that's a lot different, like citizen people stepping up and saying, we want to disrupt this, as opposed to people in government with positional power.
There is no question that you have every right to call for RT to be disbanded from YouTube, and community organizations have every right to do it. That's part of your free speech as well, to be able to do that and to participate civically. Free Press, now this is an organization we've been talking to for many, many years, and Free Press represents many things, including in that, as it was founded, to fight for a free press and against large corporate dominance of the press, including internet companies. You've been working for a free internet for a very long time. I'm sure there's some out there who look at Free Press and pushing RT to be deplatformed to YouTube thinks that that's sort of opposite of what the original mission of Free Press was. Yeah,
sure. This has come up before. And you're right. We have fought for independent media. We've fought for a more robust journalism landscape, more local journalists, less corporate consolidation of the media. We've also fought very hard for net neutrality, the idea that internet service providers, the ones who provide us access to the internet, ought not to block our access to content. And we stand by that 100%. That's still a critically important fight. In fact, one that we're working up on this year, we're going to have before the Federal Communications Commission. Those who provide access to the internet and platforms play a different role in our internet ecosystem. So as I said before, we would certainly never want internet service providers who, at my house, I have two options. Most people only have one option of how they get on the internet. We don't want any blocking or throttling happening at that level. We want people to be able to choose where they go and where they see content. Platforms is a little different story because they are not our access to the internet. They're one of the places we can visit when we go online. And what we found is that those platforms, they're not just kind of sending out, it's not a broadcast signal where everyone gets the same thing. It's not even a website where if you go to a website, if you go to freepress.net, you will see the same thing that I see when I go to freepress.net. Instead, when we go online, whether it be Meta or on, Twitter or YouTube, we have a highly curated experience. Those platforms are collecting personal information about us, about our demographics, about our behavior online, and they're creating little portfolios on all of us. And then they're curating our experience on that platform to try to get the most engagement. That is what's happening right now. We can argue whether or not that's invasive of our privacy. I would argue yes. But in any event, we're being siloed into echo chambers. Not all the time, but a lot of us only get access to a certain kind of information based on the information that the platforms collected on us. And what many actors have done is really tried to funnel a certain type of content, and sometimes that's propaganda based on our characteristics. And so that's very different than just getting online. What we're saying,
isn't that an issue of actually, though, say YouTube's own fault? I have seen this with different videos that I have done. The ones that are more edgy or, come closer to the line, get far more attention. I look where that traffic comes in from. It's coming from videos that YouTube is suggesting, but that's not necessarily the person who I interviewed's fault. That's the algorithm from YouTube.
Yeah,
itself.
Yes, absolutely. And what we're saying is that is YouTube's fault. That's the algorithm's fault. And that the company, when those algorithms are repeatedly sending people to propaganda or bigotry, that they have a responsibility to disrupt that cycle. And here's why. And let me connect it back to a free press. The internet experience of women and people of color on these platforms is often very different. And over the past 10 years or so, it's very clear that there are organized campaigns to get us to shut up. Meaning we are targeted online. We are, when we speak our mind, and I'm sure I'll get it from this. Every time I'm on TV, I get a death threat or a rape threat. And the purpose there, and it's very coordinated, it's very organized, is to shout us down. And so free speech has never been as free for women and people of color as it has been for white men. And we're trying to disrupt the dog pile of bigotry, the dog pile of disinformation that makes it harder for people to access truthful information and to understand what's actually happening in their communities. And so it's an imperfect fight. I'll admit that. This isn't easy, but what we're trying to parse here at the end of the day is everyone has a right to get online and speak. Not everyone has the right to amplification. And especially when that amplification is harming people, when it's leading to them being dogpiled and silenced, when it's leading them to, make bad decisions. We saw this play out in the pandemic where people weren't getting truthful information about the vaccine or about how to keep their families safe. And it was heartbreaking to many people who watched their families, make bad decisions about their health, sometimes deadly decisions about their health. And so I don't mean to take us completely off the subject, but what I'm saying is there is a balance to be struck here, because when others are allowed to dogpile me in that way, it makes me think twice next time about speaking my truth. So there, in the free speech analysis that we've held in this country for many, many years now, there's never quite been, until the past few years, in my view, an analysis of how power and race and gender play into how we balance free speech interests, right? And so while I think it's really important that governments don't dictate who gets to speak and how, I also think it's really important to look at this through the lens of who is able to really speak freely and who isn't, based on demographic characteristics. And that's what the Change the Terms Coalition has tried to bring to this debate. There is a balance to be struck here so that everyone can speak freely, not just those who've already gained a prominent place in our media. And this is how this ties up to our anti-consolidation work. Free press isn't just about giving more voice to the people who already have prominent platforms in the media. We are about making sure that new speakers, and particularly that racial, ethnic minorities, have a more prominent place in our media landscape. And the history of our media system has not well served women and people of color. And we are reimagining what it looks like to have a media that supports a multiracial democracy, because that's what we're going to need going forward. So I'm not purporting here to have all the answers, Mitch, but what I'm saying is there was no good old days of the media. We have to reimagine something more equitable, something that serves a greater part of the population and informs the electorate to be prepared for the United States to move from a sort of white held, power structure to a multiracial power structure. That's the dream here.
I'm very sorry to hear about the threats towards you. And
thanks.
Well, and I
part
truly,
of the job, unfortunately.
No, I
had to make a choice many years ago of whether this was worth it.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the world that we are in now. And I truly, truly hope that you don't experience that with this interview. So, Jessica González, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Jessica González has been our guest. Again, she is the co-CEO of the media activist group Free Press. She's also co-founder of the campaign Change the Terms.